Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and this is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. I'm joined right now by Emily Logan, a legend in the field of influencing people, if I do say so. Emily was formerly the Ombudsman for Children and also Chief Commissioner at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So Emily, maybe you can tell me about yourself and your background and what you learned from those roles.
I suppose of most relevance to this, Jane, is the last 16 years of my career, where I spent 11 of those years as Ireland's first Ombudsman for Children, and the last 5 as Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And the Ombudsman institution was one of what people describe internationally as a hybrid institution. So people are familiar with the traditional role of an ombudsman to undertake investigations or inquiry, but it unusually had a very explicit remit to promote children's rights and promote human rights, and specifically look at international instruments like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I suppose for the last 16 years as a domestic actor, I've been trying to do that nationally and then internationally with them across UN treaty bodies in particular.
Okay, so you have engaged for a fair long period then, 16 years with politicians and policymakers on the island of Ireland, and also in both roles, I guess, as Ombudsman for Children with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the committee there, as well as other international treaty monitoring bodies as the Commissioner at IHREC. One of the things that you achieved, and it's relevant to both briefs, I think, was the ending of imprisonment of children in Ireland. Were you proud of that achievement?
Very, very proud. And to this day, I'm still extremely proud of it. And it's something I think you get very attached to these pieces of work when you see outcomes, however long they take. They stay with you. And I know certainly I'm in conversation with Professor Ursula Kilkelly, who would have been a wonderful support in terms of having an academic behind me was really important. But it's something that stays with you, and we're still talking about it this week.
Yeah.
Years later.
Yes, well, Fianna Ní and I were talking about it yesterday when I spoke to her about penal policy, and how in 2011 in Geneva, the Secretary General of the Department of Justice, who led the delegation, referred to a report that you had done as Ombudsman into St. Patrick's Institution, I think it was, about the young boys. About the young boys. Do you know what happened there? Oh no!
Dropped for a minute. Did it?
Yeah, it's just. Oh no! We'll see if it's okay. It seems to be okay now. Sorry, Emily. I don't know whether I can edit that out, but just that the report was referred to, and there was a serious quibble as to the veracity of the boys' perceptions, I think was the word he used. And you were back in Ireland and heard this because it was webcast, and issued a strongly worded statement kind of about the work and the boys' experiences. I suppose these instruments and these mechanisms are a way of holding the state to account as well. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. And one of the central, I mean, if you use that as an example, one of the things that I personally like about human rights is people are very familiar with the prohibition on discrimination. So the negative articulation of what it means to respect and treat people with dignity. But there's also a second part of it that I really found very interesting, especially in the last 16 years, was the idea of people's own agency and people's self-determination. And that was really what we were doing in St. Patrick's Institution. We went into a medium secure prison with young people between the ages of 16 and 17 who were children, legally children. And what we decided to do was, in addition to doing, I suppose, a strong, credible research piece where we were looking at the international instruments, we coupled that with an inquiry where the children in the prison themselves told us about their experience. And one of my outstanding memories was, in fact, their fear in relation to what's called internationally violence against children. And the first thing was that the environment in which they were in was a custodial environment that had existed in Ireland for years, but was completely unsuitable for children. But what was also really interesting in terms of reflecting on the learning was, for me, was that the idea that you would speak to children themselves, especially children in the context of those who've been involved in the criminal justice system. So they were all there for a reason. They were there because they were being punished for crimes that they had committed. But internationally, it is still really, really clear that it's the deprivation of your liberty that is the punishment. And that beyond that, in my view, St. Patrick's had engaged in punitive practices that actually were not respectful of the children. So I was hugely, to put it mildly, disappointed that the most senior civil servant in the Department of Justice would sit in front of an international committee, and his comments inferred that they were lying, essentially. And to be perfectly honest, I was absolutely livid, because I wasn't in a position to go and sit in front of the committee and to take that opportunity and to use that timing to say that was actually, he did me a huge service, because the committee reacted really badly. I know, Jane, we were together at the next committee against torture, and this was an UNCAT committee. So it was a committee looking at inhuman and degrading treatment, which was exactly, was very central to the way the boys were treated in St. Patrick's Institution. So it backfired on him. So I suppose the only thing that I could do here in Ireland was to make a public statement to say how disappointed I was that that was the view of the most senior civil servant in the Department of Justice to a piece of work that was being carried out, after all, by what I was an independent officer of the state, appointed by our head of state, with a piece of legislation that was determined by our national parliament. So there are occasions where you have to assert not only yourself, but your institution, and stand up for the work and the mandate that we had. Like I wasn't just doing that because I wanted to do it. It was a piece of legislation. I was working to a very clear piece of legislation and a mandate that was given to me by the National Parliament here in Ireland.
And of course, those boys, those children that you spoke to were and are some of the most vulnerable children in the state. And you were also giving them an opportunity to use their voices. I'm quite interested in this idea. And obviously, it's a human rights thing that children should have their voices heard in all matters affecting them. So this was a way also of exerting their human rights in the context of this particular piece of work. And then to have someone in Geneva at a human rights hearing kind of poo-pooing the truthfulness of these voices was, of course, disappointing. What other policy achievements, though, Emily, aside from the ending of child imprisonment, would you be particularly proud of?
I suppose one of the big ones was the change to the Constitution. And while the person who started this was retired Supreme Court Justice Catherine McGuinness in 1993, once she got onto the bench, you then cannot publicly advocate. So I suppose I took up the mantle when I started as Ombudsman, and then the baton was handed over to NGOs who could run a campaign when I certainly wasn't allowed to participate. As a public servant, you're not permitted to do that kind of campaigning for a referendum. So I wouldn't say it's my personal. We made as an office, we made a contribution, but it would be overstating it to say it was my personal win. But I do think it stands out for me because sometimes you have to do something that may appear to be quite aspirational, and other people may not believe in it, but it's something that can make a difference if you achieve it. And certainly it gave ourselves in the Ombudsman for Children's Office a goal for many years. In fact, there are multiple reports where we appeared before the Oireachtas, whereas before Oireachtas committees, there were multiple constitutional review groups, multiple Oireachtas committees then dedicated to looking at the amendment to the Children's Constitution. And of course, it wasn't as big, it wasn't as popular as the two referenda that have excited the nation recently in terms of marriage equality and the Eighth Amendment. And I suppose what it was important given the mandate that I was undertaking at the time. But the big one there, I suppose, was the relationships that you have referred to yourself, Jane, is that never to feel that you're on your own in terms of trying to achieve policy change or legislation or any kind of change, that it's understanding that you might have a contribution to make, and then identifying who else you can collaborate with, or is there a role that you play that complements somebody else? So that's why I mentioned the campaign, because for a referenda, if you're a public servant, you can't engage at that time, you can't engage in that work, but you can certainly engage with ministers. And one of my outstanding memories there was myself and Catherine McGuinness, retired Supreme Court judge, developed this kind of informal alliance, where we went to, and we went around senior cabinet, meetings with senior cabinet ministers and the Taoiseach of the day, who was Enda Kenny. And one by one, we just talked to them about the wording, because we saw our role very much about the wording, and trying to get the wording as broadly articulated as it could. Now, when you mentioned children in detention, children in the justice system were not included in that wording, which was disappointing. But you have to aspire to what you know is the correct standard, but you will constantly find people who have to implement these things trying to bring you down to a minimum standard. So it's trying to navigate that space.
And that can be so challenging, of course, when you want the sun, moon and stars, or at least a bit more of a twinkle, and they're, as you say, boiling it down to the absolute bare minimum. Can you just remind me a little bit about that referendum? It was essentially granting children rights in their own right, outside of the family, wasn't that correct?
That's right, yeah. I mean, our constitution essentially doesn't treat children as independent rights holders. And children's rights, this is subjective now, children's rights are subordinate to parents. Now, in the greater scheme of things, and certainly in my experience, parents are always the strongest advocates for children. But all of the children that we worked with, so children in detention, children in residential care, refugee children, so children in the asylum process, but who are separated from any legal guardian, who were here on their own, who at the time, there were hundreds of children going missing from the care system. So there are multiple children in spaces that are, I suppose, children that are without parental care. And it makes you more vulnerable. You have that power differential, you have the state in charge of you. So while the Constitution, of course, protects children in the family context, it kind of omitted a whole group of children who don't have those advocates who are there fighting for them if something happens, or if additional support is required from the state. So it was, I mean, the referendum was one, but it certainly didn't generate the kind of excitement that the other two referenda did. I think possibly because people just took it for granted that you know, Ireland is a compassionate society that, yes, has always, in my experience, wanted to make sure that children are treated well and treated properly.
One of the things that I became very interested in over the last 4 years while I was doing my PhD on long sentence male prisoners was the impact of childhood trauma and adversity on the person, you know, on their ability to learn, on their ability to regulate their own emotions, to form positive, healthy relationships, to behave in pro-social ways. And obviously an awful lot of the harms do actually sadly occur within the family environment, because it's a huge power gap between a child and their parents, and they're utterly vulnerable. They can't run away, or they can, but that's a trauma in of itself. And the fact that in some ways people don't really want to face this reality, that there are these harms. Given the lockdown situation that we have at the moment, Emily, and the fact that, you know, children and women and vulnerable men too are maybe isolated with kind of their captors in their own home, would you be concerned for people's welfare and well-being in this state of emergency?
Oh yeah, oh yes. I mean, people talk. I suppose there's a sadness about people's homes not being a sanctuary or a place of safety, and certainly we're seeing that globally. Domestic violence, I suppose, is getting quite a mention. The vulnerability of children in their own homes. I haven't really seen UNICEF have spoken about it, and the executive director of UNICEF has sent out messages about it, but it's not part of the public debate at the moment. Sadly, in Ireland, and I know that the Savvy report is again to be repeated, but we do know that familial abuse and the mistreatment of children happens in a quarter of all of the abuse that takes place. And we have learned, sadly, for many, many years in Ireland, how people have been affected by that. So you're right, it's not limited to state authorities. Sadly, it is. Children are often mistreated by people that they know, people who are close to them, their families or neighbours or people in their community. And if you were a child and you're not going to school, because sadly for some of these children, school actually is their sanctuary or the place where they feel safe or where they get some respite from being mistreated. So yeah, it's a huge worry, but it's certainly not getting much of a mention at this immediate moment. I think it will in time, but just at this moment, it's quite rightly, domestic violence for women is being aired, but we haven't yet moved the debate to how children might be feeling in all of this.
One of the things as well that I think might be interesting in terms of our greater awareness of just even the phrase public health, you know, because of the pandemic, is to start looking, once the dust settles, who knows when down the line, to look actually at child maltreatment and abuse and neglect and in any sort of violence in the home and in our communities, you know, community violence and stressors caused by poverty, all of that, through a public health lens, you know, to look at these things as being preventable, and they have population level effects, but also individual effects. Might there be any utility or benefit in that, do you think, Emily?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look globally at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, however you feel about them politically, you have 193 countries who've signed up to some of the indicators, and one of the indicators is around understanding, for the first time ever, the Millennium Development Goals didn't really focus on the children, but SDG 16 does focus on that. It focuses on the preventability of violence against children, and that is really, I mean, it's quite incredible to see what's happening around the world. And I say that because I was also recently on the board of Plan International here in Ireland, so I'd be aware of some of the work that's happening internationally in that regard. But for ourselves in Ireland, we have that demonstrable history. We have chronicled it in reports like the Ryan report, whether it's the state, whether it's the Kilkenny incest report on an example or that would illustrate what can happen in a family. And I'm not sure we've yet come to terms with that past, or whether we have spoken and debated enough about that. I think people reach a saturation point with it and don't want to continue talking about it, but we do have to keep revisiting it and reminding ourselves of the damage that we can cause as parents, as adults in children's environments.
And just in terms of the slowness with which change often can occur. So people like yourselves and many others, Children's Rights Alliance, IHREC, academics, Ursula Kilkelly and others were calling for a long time to end child imprisonment, but it didn't happen overnight. It couldn't happen overnight. Some things do just take time. You know, you can't just shut down a prison and then you have nowhere else to put children sentenced by the courts or whatever. But what the current pandemic has shown us is that the state can act with great speed when it wants to, when there's a massive challenge like the public health and the common good demands that we act. And so things like rent freezes, a prohibition on evictions, more money being made available for people who lost their jobs. These were things that were kind of unthinkable a few weeks ago before the pandemic. You know, we were told there was a constitutional impediment. Our rights as property holders meant there couldn't be a rent freeze. Have we learned anything, do you think, people who are interested in policy making going forward about this?
Well, I think what's very interesting, as you say, I mean, what's disturbing is just the threshold we have in Ireland for our ability to radically change something. So we wait until something extraordinary has happened. So whether that's something like child abuse or whether it's the treatment of women through domestic violence, in this case it's COVID. But if you look at two examples of that are housing and health. So if you look at housing and health as a public good, housing for a long time, the withdrawal of the state from housing has meant that there is a lack of understanding of housing as a public good. And I think we have very quickly seen not only the rent freeze, but the idea of the freeze on Airbnb and the sudden availability of accommodation. And Focus Ireland were on the radio yesterday talking about how they have suddenly secured 650 apartments in the last while since COVID happened for people in situations where they need to have homes. And that happened in a matter of weeks. So that does beg the question about whether we believe that things like health and housing are a public good. Certainly in human rights terms, housing is not a commodity. It is about treating people respectfully and with dignity. Some of the people that are most vulnerable at the moment in these situations are the traveller community, who may be on halting sites where you don't have water. And you probably will have read and heard, people will have heard about the privilege that it is for those of us who are self-isolating or who are at home. I'm in a home. Mm-hmm. I'm able to go out to a garden. So, you know, I suppose what I'm hearing a lot at the moment is about how COVID's not discriminating. In fact, it does. It exposes very much the kind of inequalities that exist in Ireland and globally. If you look at health inequalities, economic inequalities, you know, it's not those of us who are living in homes and we're worried about our mental health and not being able to get out and exercise. You know, it's a very different level of concern or worry. When people are worried because they can't feed their children or they've nowhere to sleep or they don't feel safe, that's a very, very different. So to me, it has really exposed the kind of inequalities that have existed, but perhaps have jolted us as a society to see them. I don't know if people know Conor Gearty. He's an Irish academic who's in the LSE, and he often talks about human rights being a visibility project. It's there to help you to see people who may otherwise be invisible. And in this case, I think what we are seeing is how we rely very heavily on people in low-paid, precarious working to support us. Who are all the people in the essential jobs? For me, it's Ronan over across the road in the Spar who's keeping our entire road fed. It's our postman or woman. You know, all of the people who've been doing these jobs that have been unappreciated. So I'm hoping that in terms of having a more socially just society, that some of the things that we have witnessed and experienced in these weeks may make us collectively feel differently about what we want Ireland to look like post-COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the issue with Airbnbs, you know, eating up available properties in Dublin and the like, that is not just a Dublin issue. It's happened in Barcelona and many other cities. And you have to wonder, is that in the common good to allow people with these properties to make a hell of a lot of money off them when, you know, young families or just anyone can't actually find somewhere to live? So yeah, to make us question our values, I guess, and what does the common good mean? It can't be just the common good of the 1 or 5%ers. It has to extend beyond that.
And also our expectations as a society of how we want the state to respond. So, you know, the state withdrew from provision of housing many, many years ago. So I think there's certainly a growing public response for people to say, that's what we want from our state. We want our state to treat housing as if it is, not as if it is a public good, but to respond in that way. But generally politics follows the public mood. So if that's what we believe and that's what we want our public representatives to act on or to legislate for or to develop policy in, that generally that's one of the most powerful ways of influencing.
Yes, voting with our feet and all that. And I suppose people did actually in the last election, even though we don't have any new government yet, the shift to the left and the fact that in the exit polls, health and housing were two of the big key issues for people, not crime, you know, even though there were a few high profile, brutal killings and such like. Health and housing were uppermost in people's minds, and it's unlikely that they'll go down with the pandemic, and especially since so many people have lost their jobs, we're going to need to have the social safety net more than we have done as a collective for quite some time, I think. What barriers to action are there for things like ratification of international instruments? So I'm thinking of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, which the state has been saying it's going to do it any day now for over 10 years. Emily, have you any insights into the foot dragging?
When we were in the when I worked in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, this is something that we spoke to the Department of Justice about for a number of years. I think when you talk about barriers, maybe to talk about some of the structural barriers, usually these things start in the Attorney General's office. And there is a very particular and conservative approach to ratifying international treaties. You will see, certainly having sat in front of at this stage, about 7 different UN treaty bodies, you see the repetition by officials of the state to the idea that Ireland is a dualist system. So we have this constitution, and we can't be bringing in this international law in a dualist state, and just how difficult that is. So there's long been a very conservative approach to ratifying international treaties. So that's one, in the absence of having all of the legislation lined up. The second one is, I suppose, one of the big shifts, as I understood it at the time, was the definition of deprivation of liberty. So traditionally, we have understood deprivation of liberty to be designated places of detention. But we have seen, and certainly we took up a couple of cases in the Commission as amicus, where we spoke about deprivation of liberty in the context of nursing homes. And I think possibly, nobody has told me this, sometimes you infer or pick up these signals, but my sense is that one of the biggest barriers at the moment is that we have long been placing people in nursing homes without consent. And this is introducing an entire new practice, as it should be, of people consenting and being fully informed. And we sadly now see just how vulnerable people are in institutions, in something that we've been doing for many years in Ireland. We're perennially obsessed with institutionalizing people when we don't know what to do. But back to your question about OPCAT, I do think some of it is around nursing homes. So I think it's you have the Department of Justice, or the institutions under the aegis of Department of Justice, like places of detention, I think are less complicated. I think nursing homes brings with it a question mark about the practices, and they're practices that we should be questioning.
Well, yes.
But
sorry, because if they are approaching ill treatment or torture, then we have an interest as citizens in not having that take place, because there have been documentaries, primetime exposés showing grotesque practices. And the focus of OPCAT as well is preventive. So it's not about imprisoning more people for wrongdoing. It's trying to put systems in place for regular inspection. Isn't that right? So that
completely. And one example of that, actually, you've reminded me that in terms of the proactivity, this often rests in terms of responsibility for activating it with a national human rights institution. And my colleague in Greece, you've seen the children in Lesbos in the camps in Greece. It was through their work, their OPCAT work, because they're proactively out as Children's Ombudsman, as a national human rights institution, looking at those camps to see what it is that is not right, which is one of the reasons why the children are being moved. But I suppose this is not mainstream information that people comprehend, or has been, not they don't comprehend. I think we haven't tested them on whether they're interested or understand it. I think it's more official Ireland being concerned about the cost is always there, to be perfectly honest. That's not unique in Ireland. There's always a question mark about how much introducing or ratifying a treaty is going to cost the system. So for me, I think that's the biggest barrier, is the question mark about the redefinition or the new definition of deprivation of liberty, and what it will mean in particular for health and social services.
I remember someone using the phrase it was at a Dublin Castle event about deprivation as anything where you're not free to go. And it's such an interesting way of conceptualizing it. But of course, for the families around Ireland to all of a sudden conceive of their elderly parents or aunties as deprived of their liberty, it is a shift. It's a shift in conceptualizing, I suppose, what they've done to their elderly parents as well. And as you rightly mentioned, the freedom of choice, and the consent to have procedures done. Anyway, time will tell whether we can keep pushing it out down the line. Does the state, do you think, engage in meaningful consultation with all the relevant stakeholders enough, Emily?
Some of the departments that I have worked with, I would say, have vastly improved since I began 16 years ago in this work. I would say that there are some departments that are stronger than others. You've departments like the Department of Foreign Affairs, where they'll bring all of the stakeholders together from non-governmental organizations, from expert organizations, from academic institutions. Then if people are introducing a change, it's quite common for them to consult with people. But what I would say is it has become more common. But if you take, for example, I'm thinking of something like housing and the traveller community. So communities where the individual community has been most affected by it. So where I think sometimes official Ireland is comfortable to consult, they're not necessarily comfortable with consulting with people who are directly affected by change. So they might consult with
on the ground in the halting sites or whatever.
So it'll be maybe proxy. In those cases, what you sometimes see is, I suppose, what people describe as proxy advocacy, where you have the advocates, but they are the advocates who know how to behave sitting around a table, as in they know when not to push the button and when to push the button. Whereas people who are affected by these things, it's the same whether it's children in care or in prison, or whether it's people who've been deprived of their liberty, whether it's refugees, people in the asylum process. That's where I see the reluctance, is a reluctance to engage directly with people affected by it. So there's an improvement in the consultation with people who are advocates. But I think we need to take it a step further, because I think what's one of the things I really saw for the last 16 years was that the authority that in particular civil servants have when it comes to decision making. I saw that in particular in the Department of Education in relation to children and people with disabilities, where you have people right down the line, if you like, from a minister, making decisions that can quite profoundly affect an individual child or an individual family. So it's important, I think, in terms of changing policy, not to assume that the minister is making the decisions, or that you're never going to change things if you're not the person who's sitting in the room with the minister, to understand that you can influence, and there are lots of different ways and levels at which you can influence change.
Very interesting that you mentioned there about knowing how to talk in the right way, and when to take the foot off the accelerator, maybe, because I've seen this, and I asked Lynn Rowan and Cindy Joyce at a panel at the criminology conference in Cork last year, and actually Vicky Phelan as well, about watching your tone as someone with lived experience. Or did they feel like they had to be careful of what they said in order for people to actually listen? You know, so as not to offend people or be too emotional or too raw, or, I mean, these things do matter, people's lives. In Vicky Phelan's case, women's life and health was on the line. Why shouldn't you be aggravated and annoyed and, you know, furious beyond belief? But you can shut down the ability of the audience, the influencers, you know, the people who can do something to help or impede your case by the tone.
I think that's right. And I was also very conscious of that as a woman. And somebody, when I was starting out on this many years ago, somebody said to me, you know, it can be irritating, but sometimes you can achieve more by articulating your case in a dispassionate way. So you may feel very passionately about it, and whether that means talking to somebody else about it. I certainly, one of the things I found really helpful is I have a handful of people that I really trust. It's always good to pick people that are more experienced than you, to have a chat with, or to talk something through and say, this is what I'm thinking of saying. If it's something very difficult, or if you feel concerned about how strongly you feel about it, you might decide to bring somebody else with you at the table, so you can get the balance, so that you don't find yourself getting all worked up, that you say your bit and then you hand over to someone else, take a few breaths while the other person is communicating, and then take your turn. And you know, it's really difficult if somebody has been the person who's directly affected by something. Of course, that's hard. But I suppose I feel very strongly that it's so critical to hear those voices. So as an advocate, or as somebody who's in a privileged position of not being the person who's affected by it, but somebody who's trying to influence, it's understanding that that voice is important, and finding a way of allowing the people who are on the other side of the table to somehow hear that voice.
And I suppose who did that phenomenally well back in the original UN Committee Against Torture hearing was Maeve O'Rourke, with her report of the Magdalens. You know, they weren't there speaking, but she had compiled their voices and was adamant that they needed to be heard. And to be fair, Felice Gayer wanted to hear them, you know, so they weren't a massive load of super impressive statistics, you know, with massive regression analysis. They were the real raw, this is what it did to me, this is what the people did to me, and how it felt, and how it's had a lifelong toll. So do you think there is a way, or that NGOs and academics that there's a value somehow, even if the people with lived experience cannot be in the room all the time with the policymakers, that voice somehow has to be brought to the people making decisions.
I think it's very important, but I think I'm just thinking back now to say, for instance, St. Patrick's Prison. One of the ways that I found when I found there was a lot of resistance to what I was doing at all levels, was not giving up and trying to find somebody who will listen to you. Mm. And for me at the time, one of the people who didn't listen originally and admitted that he didn't listen, but then changed his mind, was at the time Judge Riley, who was the inspector of prisons. And it's believing that you can find an individual who you can convince. So maybe you can't convince everybody, but you just, it's worth to keep going at it, but perhaps you present it in a slightly different way. So just banging on about the same thing in the same way doesn't always work. What I found is thematically, for instance, St. Patrick's was the same issue, but how you present it, or who you talk to, or how you get them to understand the seriousness of what you're trying to say, you can be surprised where you will find that person. And also, the other lesson that I learned was about politics, about not assuming that certain groups or parties of politicians will not support what you're doing. You can sometimes find somebody, in fact, for me, it was the Minister for Justice, Alan Chatter at the time, who would have been seen, whose party would have been seen as a conservative party in terms of their attitude to detention and people, you know, the party of law and order. But out of that party emerged the person who actually finally said, yes, we need to close it. And he was the person who agreed to the legislation. I know it emerged when his successor was in post, but the point at which that change happened was at that time. So don't give up on political parties, and don't give up on individuals.
Yes. I think that's a great point. I'm going to finish up now, but you brought it home fantastically there, the importance of cultivating relationships, having a bit of resilience and being creative. You know, if one thing doesn't work, don't be despondent. Try and adapt your message for different ears. And that's so true, I think, Emily, in the policy making process in general, in the sense that you can't send a massive tome of a piece of academic research necessarily to politicians and expect them to read it. A 2-page briefing they'll read, and they will run with it quite possibly. So you have to have different types of research or documents for different audience as well. Isn't that right?
Most definitely. People don't, I mean, however right and however perfect your piece of research is, you also have to understand that people have just so much on their desks. So being considerate to your reader or the person you're trying to influence, it's worthwhile. It's worth considering.
There you go. Emily Logan, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all those wonderful thoughts and experiences and insights. I'm very grateful to you. I wasn't considerate with your time. I took too much of it, but anyway, thank you very much.
We all have time trapped in our houses. Thanks, Jane.
That's true.
Best of luck.
How to Talk Policy and Influence People. That was Emily Logan. Thanks so much. Bye now.